Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome those of you here in person at the University of Strathclyde Law School and those joining us online for this exciting IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, Climate Change Law Specialist Group webinar and in-person event. We have a really exciting morning planned for you. We're going to talk about climate change, about law, about politics, about networks in these fields. But before we begin doing that, I am absolutely super happy to have the chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law together with here, a dear friend and colleague, Professor Dr. Christina Voigt, to say a few words to opening today's session. I give you the floor, Christina.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Francesco. And also on behalf of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law, I have the distinct pleasure to welcome everyone both there in person, and I'm very, very sorry for not being able to be with you in person, but also all those who join us online today to this hybrid seminar in the series that we've been running for the last almost 4 years titled The Transformative Power of Law, Addressing Global Environmental Challenges. And in that series, we always try to reflect and discuss recent events and recent developments. And of course, it is very pertinent to discuss what happened at COP30 in Belém in Brazil in the context of the ICJ advisory opinion, in particular, reflecting and questioning the uptake or the lack thereof of the ICJ advisory opinion in the diplomatic processes under the COP. Now, first, I'd like to thank you, Francesco, Professor Dr. Francesco Sindico, who is the co-chair of the IUCN WCEL Climate Law Specialist Group, and he was instrumental in bringing IUCN to the ICJ, both for our written submissions and then also, of course, for the oral intervention. And I would like again to thank you so much, Francesco, for that incredible work and amount of work you put into this effort. I also thank you, of course, for organizing this today, this whole discussion around today. And I would like to welcome all the speakers with you. I understand you have, at least for the morning session, Kate and Anna and Leah and Varnika, and I'd love to listen to you in person. I'll stay online to be at least virtually with you. And of course, I'd like to welcome all the audiencers that are with us here in person and online. Now, as we all know, the ICJ advisory opinion, and I'm sure, Francesco, you will go into much deeper discussions, but just a brief background for our webinar today or seminar today. The ICJ advisory opinion of the 23rd of July this year was and is a milestone in climate law, in particular because it clarified to all of us in the entire world the obligations that states have under international law, both treaty law and customary law, with respect to protecting the climate system. And it was also, the ICJ was the first international court who really had the possibility to deeply engage in an interpretation of the UN climate treaties, in addition to other treaties, of course, as well. But no court prior to the ICJ had really dared to interpret the rather difficult negotiated provisions of the Paris Agreement. But the ICJ did, and it did that with a great level of detail. And I think 4 particular issues stand out here in this context. I will just briefly sketch them out. One is the relationship between the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. The second one is the clarification of the 1.5-degree goal as the primary temperature goal, or what the court called the scientific consensus target. Third aspect that is important is the clarification on the contemporary understanding of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. in a way that is nuanced, that it's dynamic, it's not set in stone, and it takes into account the ever-changing geopolitical realities of our current world. The fourth element that is very important, and I think we will probably come back to that today, is of course the clarification of the legal obligations in the Paris Agreement, both with regard to obligations of result, very clearly states have an obligation to prepare and submit and maintain their NDCs, do that every 5 years, account for it, and so forth, but also the obligation of conduct. And I think that's perhaps with regard to the Paris Agreement, the most important and innovative aspect of the ICJ advisory opinion, obligations of conduct with respect to the content of the NDC and with respect to implementing and achieving the NDC based on a stringent level of due diligence. We also know that further clarifications on adaptation obligations and finance obligations, as well as clarifications, of course, of other treaty law and customary international law and legal obligations, all went into that comprehensive advisory opinion. Now, what does that mean that the ICJ went so squarely into UN climate treaties? What does that mean for the UN climate diplomacy processes, in particular the COP? And I understand that this is at least the topic of the first part of today's discussion. Well, the COP, we know from COP30 in Belém that it didn't mean terribly much, right? There was no, despite many, many interventions by many parties, there really was no reflection of the ICJ advisory opinion in any of the outcome decisions, neither in the cover decision, the Mutirão decision, nor in any other decision on the mitigation work program or anything else. And it will be very interesting, I think, to discuss why this happened. What are the reasons for not reflecting the ICJ advisory opinion in the COP30 outcome? Neither do we have yet any reflection in the processes and the United Nations General Assembly. When we talk about climate diplomacy, of course, that is a forum which is to be reckoned with, and we don't have yet any resolution that welcomes or adopts or whatever it will do the advisory opinion which this UN body had the court asked for. Now, eventually, it might be much more important to follow up on the ICJ advisory opinion in domestic processes, right? In processes that go on the national level, either in legislative changes, regulatory changes, in the development of the next round or this round of NDCs, or in national climate cases. And we already have several judgment which refer to the ICJ advisory opinion, not the least the European Court on Human Rights in its recent judgment on Greenpeace Nordic against Norway. Now, I'm very much looking forward to the discussions today on the relationship between climate diplomacy and climate jurisprudence of international courts, a discussion of where these two worlds intersect and why, or where don't intersect and why, and to carve out some of the reasons for maybe a bit reluctance that we are still seeing, but also with the hope to bring them closer together and to cross-fertilize these two eras or engagements or platforms of engagement with climate law. And with that, back to you, Francesco, and many, many thanks again for organizing today's event.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christina. Always lovely to have you to start out. And, with Christina, we have really firsthand experience on both fronts. So it's great to have your insight. And if you can stay, absolutely fantastic. So yes, okay. So just to share with you, especially those in the room, what's going to happen today. We're going to have a first part of the morning, which will discuss precisely the relationship between the advisory opinion and the COP process. I'll give a little bit of a talk. Then we have three amazing speakers, moderated by Kate, Varnika, Chawla, Anna Kantzelis, and Leah Weimann. We're going to have a bit of a discussion. And then we have enough time for all of us to actually enter into a further discussion, both online and in person. Have a coffee break at 10:30. And then those who can stay, we're going to have for an hour a discussion about the bigger picture of IUCN, the World Commission on Environmental Law, and the specialist group that I have the pleasure to co-chair. At 12 we finish. There's no lunch provided, but we can have lunch together if you want to stay. Okay, so it's a bit of a momentous moment, if you want. 10 years ago, the Paris Agreement was adopted. Just a year ago, Christina and I had the pleasure of actually concluding the oral statements before the International Court of Justice in the advisory opinion. And in both cases, I remember very vividly people, especially non-lawyers, asking me, is the outcome legally binding? That was a very big question that a lot of people had, and I'll get back to that at the end of my talk. So today we're going to be talking precisely of this relationship, as Christina mentioned, of these two processes, the judicial process, and if you want, the political process of COPs. But I'd really like to focus on one thing, on the phase out of fossil fuels as a key measure to tackle climate change, and to see the extent to which it is present or not in both processes and what has happened to it, especially in the last COP. So on the one hand, we have the highest judicial body of the world, the ICJ, that has clarified what states have to do as a matter of international law to protect the climate system. On the other hand, you have the international climate change negotiations that over the years have shaped the international community's response to climate change. Now, one would hope that both processes align and point in the same direction. For example, phase out of fossil fuels, strengthening each other in the future. Now, in order to fully understand this, one has to take a little bit of a step back. And at least, although we could probably take it even further step back, but at least to 2015, when the Paris Agreement was adopted. We will then fast forward to the first outcome of the global stocktake in 2023 at COP28. And if you see, there's a parallel process starting there when the AO process, AO stands for advisory opinion, starts in 2023, at least the formal part of it, and ends in 2025 after the oral proceedings that took place in December 2024. We then have the latest iteration, which is obviously the COP30 in Berlin. And next year we have COP31 with a very strange mix of Australia v Turkey and the UNGA resolution. UNGA stands for United Nations General Assembly, that endorses and brings back home, if you want, the ICJ AO. Now, one problem I think is that the Paris Agreement is often misunderstood. What it has set up is a machine, an engine for climate change cooperation. Every state has to submit a nationally determined contribution every 5 years. Every party has to improve on its previous NDC, submitting a more ambitious plan every 5 years. And every state has to pursue domestic measures to implement the NDC. The overall combination of these state efforts should ultimately move the international community towards the 1.5 temperature goal. One of the key pieces of this machine, of this engine, is the global stocktake, which takes place every 5 years and is a process that evaluates whether the global efforts are going in the right direction. The outcome of the global stocktake has to inform the next iteration of NDCs. And I emphasize that has to, because these are legally binding obligations upon states. So the word fossil fuels, as far as I'm aware, was not present in the Paris Agreement in 2015, but it made its way in the outcome of the global stocktake adopted at the end of COP28 in Dubai in 2023. But phase out was only referred to inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Parties were only able to agree on transitioning away from fossil fuels and only to phase down unabated coal power. Now, as I said, the outcome needs to inform, as a matter of law, the next NDC of parties, which most of them have already been submitted in 2025, but not all. So This takes us to 2023. By then, UNGA had already adopted in March 2023 a resolution requesting the ICJ to answer 2 questions related to state obligations to protect the climate system. I was lucky enough to be with IUCN in Dubai at COP28, and I really recall vividly, especially the campaigners were really excited about the year coming ahead and the oral proceedings and all the arguments to be put before the court. What are these 2 questions? Now, very, very simply, these are very trivialized if you want, but they can be summarized as: what do states have to do to protect the climate system? And the second, what happens to states if they do not follow the law? How did the court answer these questions? Again, in a very simple way. On the one hand, it called for states to operate with a stringent level of due diligence in the implementation of the Paris Agreement and of other treaty and customary obligations to protect the climate system. On the other hand, the court clarifies that if states fail to operate with the required level of high due diligence, they can incur into an unlawful action under international law, opening the door, leaving the door ajar to possible compensation for climate change related damages. And that was a big, big thing to say. Some people just interpret it, some people say it very clearly, but let's see that there is something there. Now, due diligence, and we have in the room experts on due diligence even much more than me, but requires states to put in place the necessary legislative and regulatory measures to protect the climate system. The level, whether be it very low or very high, depends on a number of things. Possible harm, the level, low, high, the foreseeability, did we know that harm may occur, and capacity of a single country to actually take action against that harm. The court, and this is important, the court has made it very clear, A, that climate change poses an existential threat, so a very high level of harm. B, that states have known the relationship between the greenhouse gas emissions and the harm for quite a long time. And C, that some countries more than others do have high capacity to deal with this. So, what does all this mean for the phase out of fossil fuels? I won't read this out loud, but take a moment, both online and here in the room, to read paragraph 427 of the International Court of Justice advisory opinion and let it sink in. What the court is saying is that the granting of fossil fuel exploration licenses, the production and consumption of fossil fuels, and granting of fossil fuel subsidies could all be illegal under international law. That is a big thing to say. And that's where a lot of lawyers in particular, when this was read out loud, we gasped and said, oh my God, what is happening here? So with this in mind, with that quote registered into your minds, parties went into COP31 in Belém, the Brazilian Amazon, with what for some seemed like a seismic shift from the outcome of the global stocktake that asked parties to transition away from fossil fuels to a court, not just any court, the highest court of the world, clarifying that as a matter of international law, states could breach their international obligations to protect the climate system by opening new oil and gas fields or granting fossil fuel subsidies. So, was the outcome of COP30 affected by this legal earthquake? Not sure. Just one second. Apparently, I'm not sharing my screen. Can you see it now? Yes? Okay. My most sincere apologies for our colleagues online. Apparently, I wasn't sharing the screen. So, okay. So, was the outcome of COP30 affected by this legal earthquake? The answer seems, as Christina said also before, seems to be a resounding no. The COP30 cover decision, in a way, this is a bit harsh, but in a way seems to take back the clock almost to 2015, focusing a lot, not only, but a lot on 2 degrees as the temperature goal, and not on 1.5, which Christina mentioned was one of the 4 main, or probably more, but the 4 that Christina highlighted this morning, outcomes of the ICJ outcome. The court, however, even in the cover decision, then goes back and does refer often to the 1.5 temperature degrees. What the COP30 cover decision does, and it's a good thing in my opinion, it clarifies that states now need to move from negotiation to implementation. And in order to do so, creates 2 new processes, which you have on the slides, the Global Implementation Accelerator and the Belém Mission to 1.5. However, and this could be the answer to the relationship or to the input, at least formally, in terms of the outcome at the end, the ICJ advisory opinion and any reference to fossil fuel phase out are nowhere to be found. So then the question, which is the same one that Christina had, is, does that mean that states have just forgotten about them coming to Belém and not brought them to the attention of COP? Well, I would say quite the opposite. So many states, as well as advocates and campaigners, tried hard to bring the outcome of the advisory opinion in and the fossil fuel phase out. But maybe what can be achieved before a court, even the highest court of the world, may be different to what can be secured through international negotiations. Any country or campaigner who fought hard to bring the biggest problem of all to the highest court of all, and was hoping that the decision at COP30 would include language akin to the most progressive parts of the ICJ-AO, well, let's be honest, came home bitterly disappointed. But again, maybe the problem is the level of expectation of what happens at COP, of the cover decision at COP. To think that that COP decision would have language akin to, we agree that the largest emitters are under a stringent due diligence obligation to protect the climate system, and any new fossil fuel related activity is incompatible with such stringent level of due diligence, was, let's be honest, probably wishful thinking. Now, Brazil, highlighting its position as COP president, decided to move the phase out of fossil fuels outside of the formal COP process. And there appear to be 80 countries, probably counting, who support such at least an idea of a roadmap of phasing out fossil fuels. And Brazil endorsed the first international conference on such topics scheduled in Colombia, endorsed by both Colombian and Dutch government in April 2026. Whether this new process will be able to bring together other similar processes like the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance or the Fossil Fuels Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative is obviously to be seen. So, getting towards the end of my talk. What seems to be clear, at least in my opinion, is that countries who have blocked the phase out of fossil fuels in the COP process were probably feeling a bit frustrated in this setting, the ICJ setting, because this was a system where countries could not put down red lines and negotiate around them. The ICJ process any legal process, to some extent judicial process, is not one where a country can stubbornly put a veto, despite a vast majority of countries arguing indifferently. So they found themselves in a process where the only thing they could do was lay out their legal arguments in front of a court of law. It was for such court to make a decision as to which points presented in front of it were right or wrong. There was no negotiation space. Surely not a comfortable environment for those countries with great diplomatic power at COP and that are not keen to move quickly away from fossil fuels. On the other hand, the ICJ process proved to be a welcoming environment for more progressive countries when it came to fossil fuels, and especially for countries with smaller diplomatic status and power at COP. Let's be honest, all countries before the ICJ and non-countries, including the IUCN as an international organization, hybrid, were given the same opportunities, including the same amount of airtime, if you want, before the court in the oral proceedings. So some of those happy with the outcome of the ICJ wanted its content to filter immediately into the negotiations. No more doubts around 1.5 or 2 degrees. No more doubts about the legally binding nature of Article 4.2 of the Paris Agreement, as well as other provisions. No shying away from the need to phase out of fossil fuels, not as a policy option, but as a matter of compliance with international law. Well, landing at COP30, these parties were reminded that the two processes operate in very different ways. Those same countries frustrated before the ICJ were happy to regain control of the procedural narrative. They just had to hold their line, despite the growing interest, and there was growing interest and support for including the phase out of fossil fuels in the final COP decision. At the end, they succeeded in moving away a fossil fuel phase-out roadmap from the official COP process. So, in the room, online, should we be concerned at this outcome? I think we should not be pleased, but at the same time not too surprised. Multilateralism, a lot of people, me included, although there are some glimmers of hope, is in crisis. And the fact that a negotiation process with almost 200 countries, 200 voices, finds it difficult, was not able to agree on such a complex issue, such like a roadmap on fossil fuel phase-out, should not be construed as a failure of the international climate change process. However, the relationship between the two, between the international climate change process and the judiciary, if you want, points to a tension between law and politics. International law is telling states they have to phase out fossil fuels under certain circumstances. International politics stalls and takes time. The real question becomes how to operationalize the content of the International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion and others, whilst this tension exists or potentially increases. And this is, I know, something that at IUCN and also with Christina, Voigt, and our colleagues were very interested in. A further question is whether the content of the advisory opinion should be brought into COP31 whilst this tension continues. Was it too soon, COP30? Do we need to give it a bit more time? Or whether those working to drive impact from the advisory opinion should look elsewhere. The two key areas of engagement appear to be through international processes parallel to COP, the ones we just mentioned, Colombia, Netherlands, or maybe through domestic and international litigation. And literally my last slide. To conclude, the two processes have not officially met. These two pictures are not completely overlapping. They're still somewhat one next to each other. In relation to the specific focus I wanted to give today, the fossil fuels phase out, the court includes important legal considerations that can be interpreted as moving in such direction. On the other hand, the COP process has slowly and cautiously started to refer to fossil fuels in the first global stocktake COP decision, but appears to have moved away from it in the Cover COP30 decision. The phase out of fossil fuels is now left to non-COP processes led by champions and built around coalitions of the willing. At the same time, one could argue that the advisory opinion is starting to have an impact, just like Christina said, in domestic settings by being used in litigation by plaintiffs keen to phase out fossil fuels, which is something we may want to discuss in the Q&A, both here in the room and online. I stop there and I thank you very much. And I now give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Kate McKenzie, CEO of the Climate Change Legal Initiative, to moderate a discussion with our speakers.
Thank you, Francesco. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen because I don't think we have any slides. Oh, yeah. Well, too late now. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us this morning, both in the room and online. We're just setting up for those online who can't really see what's happening beside me here. We're setting up a bit of a panel. We want to have a conversation about some of the nuances of what we're talking about today. And so you'll have to forgive us online for the little, it might take a moment for the speakers to come and speak because they're physically going to have to move from where they're sitting in a panel to up here so you can hear and see them. So just apologies in advance for the moments it will take to go between speakers. We want to have this panel conversation. I'm joined here today by three brilliant women, all of whom have expertise in different areas, who come with different perspectives and can lead us in a more deep and rich conversation really about what we're hearing about today, the relationship between the ICJ's advisory opinion and the COP process. So I'm joined today by Anna Kantzelis, who is an associate member at Six Pump Court Chambers, Varnika Chawla, who is the director of Climate Asset Management, and Leah Weimann, who is a PhD researcher at the University of Cambridge Faculty of Law. So I will start with my first question to Anna and ask you to speak a little bit about Francesco and Christina both spoke about both the ICJ and COP30. And I wonder, Anna, if you could give us just your thoughts on the parallel processes, the geopolitical sort of negotiations, the legal landscape, how these two things fit together, what are the linkages, and just contextualize for us COP in the broader geopolitical and legal landscape.
Thank you, Kate. Good morning to everyone who's online and to panelists, and thank you to Francesco for that very rich overview and Christina for the opening remarks. I worked with a state in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated. I've since worked on litigation, and I also support civil society advocacy trying to influence and move the COP process. So that's my background, so you understand my framing. So to pick up on the point that I've been invited to speak to, and which Francesco also raised, this thread about international law and geopolitics and parallel processes. How does this all fit together? So I wouldn't, they're separate spheres, but connected is the way that I think about this. And this becomes very clear in the context of climate. So what we're seeing is that states are continuing to rely on multilateral legal processes. They negotiate Paris Agreement and other treaty texts. We see them coming back every year to the COPs. They were willing to seek an advisory opinion by making that request to the UNGA. So that shows that even in a fragmented world, states still seem to want or need shared rules and institutions. The legal concepts, some of them that Francesco covered off in his opening presentation, like the no harm rule or a duty to cooperate. These are basic standards that give states a common language for coordinating their expectations and for building coalitions that are not simply an extension of the great power rivalry that also is a very important factor on the international plane. But at the same time, the reality is that these legal processes now operate in a much harsher geopolitical context and environment than even a decade ago when Paris was being negotiated. And I'm finding, not so much when I speak to an audience like this, where we might be speaking to a law school where I'm asked to talk about the state of the law itself, but in audiences that are a bit more mixed, if I'm giving an overview of the state of international law or what the ICJ has said, very often an audience question immediately at the end of my presentation will be, why does any of this matter though? Like, does anybody actually care? Will states actually listen to any of this? And I think part of the reason why this question is so live at the moment is the United States withdrawal from and re-entry from Paris. In and out, major powers are asserting more robust notions of sovereignty. We have wars going on, but also in relation to climate and trade policy more specifically. We see that around fossil fuel diplomacy, disputes over carbon border measures, fights in parallel political process to do with setting of standards, like in the International Maritime Organization or with respect to aviation rules. All of this to say that where legal norms cut across perceived strategic or economic interests, I think they're stretched, they can be selectively applied, and they can sometimes also be ignored. So what role does Paris and the COT system then play in that context? And I think that its comparative strength, what it does for us that not much else can do, and I think why that system exists, is that it provides a coordination, a signaling function with respect to a collective action problem. So what it does well is that it's relatively effective at setting shared goals, structuring cycles of national pledges, and agreeing common measurement and reporting rules. That's the machine or architecture that Francesco set out really beautifully. But when the discussion then moves from those kinds of commitments on paper to actual delivery, implementation, phasing down fossil fuels or allocating concrete climate finance to terrain changes, because these issues engage really hard domestic political choices over energy security, competitiveness, debt, jobs, and domestic distribution choices. And all of those negotiations is maybe not the right word, given what we're talking about. These constraints are based outside of the COP setting. So international law remains an important, but just one layer in a broader system where interests, capacities, and alliances are often more decisive. And so appeals to law, including the ICJ advisory opinion, have uneven effects. And I think matter most when they align with those other underlying dynamics. And I think, yeah, my comment in summary is that I think that's an important backdrop to keep in mind when thinking about how the court's opinion might be taken forward. And then in discussion, I hope we can pick up the threads of, I have a lot that I'd like to add in response to what Francesco said.
Good, excellent, thank you. Thank you, Anna, for getting us started. That was a good sort of jumping off point. I think there's lots more to discuss there. So continuing on the sort of beginning of the conversation, I'd like to move on to Varnika. I'm curious, Varnika, if you can speak a little bit about the impact of the ICJ advisory opinion on the COP process generally, but especially as it affects the private sector. Particularly looking at implementation of climate laws, of these commitments that have been made, especially looking from your perspective from in the finance industry and what that really means and how that sort of connects up.
Thank you, Kate and Anna and Francesco and Christina for setting the stage. And I do apologize in advance for my lingering cough, but I do promise I'm not infectious anymore. Just as by way of background, I work at Climate Asset Management, which is a firm that has been set up with the intention to invest exclusively in natural capital and make most use of these international and geopolitical processes in a way that incentivizes investments into nature. And that's the perspective that I aim to bring today in the next few minutes. So I think broadly, there are two critical segments that I'd like to break up the positive impacts of the advisory opinion on private sector financing and on-ground implementation thereof. The first is the key critical points that are coming out of the advisory opinion that can be relied upon to demonstrate a positive influence and movement towards investing into nature-based solutions and away from activities that cause significant harm to the environment. And then the second is the sort of impact that it creates in terms of creating an entire new investable asset class at scale through nature, forestry, and regenerative agricultural practices. So I'll briefly highlight those critical points, and I think Christina and Francesco have already set out the key legal principles that were formulated in the advisory opinion. But the sort of private sector points of relevance would be an overarching principle of sustainable development, which was highlighted by the court as the umbrella framework within which states' responsibility are guided, and the court then noted that this is the overarching framework for states to apply in terms of their responsibility for climate change. This then led to espousing two key duties. The first was a duty to prevent significant harm, and the court noted in its opinion that this duty is not restricted only to instances of direct cross-border harm, but also looks at global environmental concerns. And as a result of that, another duty that the court looked at was that mitigation of climate change issues and effects actively involves human interventions to reduce emissions and or enhance carbon sinks, as a result of which countries need to be developing their nationally determined contributions, which need to reflect the highest level of ambition to actually sequester carbon. This then led to two implementing frameworks within the advisory opinion in the sense that we've interpreted it in the private sector. The first was of financial assistance and a duty under Article 9 of the Paris Agreement that was also reiterated by the opinion. The developed countries shall provide financial resources to assist developing countries in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And the second aspect was on due diligence, which essentially said that states have a responsibility to impose stringent due diligence standards and potentially even look at strict liability standards when it comes to due diligence, including through regulatory or litigation measures. So these are the sort of overarching principles of the opinion that are now leading to a greater focus of investing into nature-based solutions, or more broadly, climate change mitigation solutions. And so those practical impacts can be classified, or at least the way I like to remember them, is these three I's that are impactful from the decision. The first is investability. So that's the first I. And that essentially says that there is greater room now for interpreting regulatory developments in a way that is expansive and that enhances a focus on nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions are being mainstreamed as an investable asset class because there are greater regulatory incentives or fewer barriers to interpret laws in a way to allow for land use control and for ecosystem protection measures. So nature-based solution financing is becoming part of legal compliance and not just a discretionary policy measure. The second aspect, which I think is critical to this field, is integrity. And this decision increases the integrity of investing in a nascent asset class such as nature, which so far has not been utilized for the financial opportunity that it necessarily brings. This integrity can be looked at through a lens of heightened litigation risk around significant harm, which means that governments are more likely to create and impose financial pathways to uphold conservation zones, to uphold restoration mandates, to protect Indigenous peoples' rights and local community rights on their land, and to compel mitigation and decarbonization plans. But this can also be seen as a clear market opportunity to create investments that uphold all of those basic principles related to climate change mitigation. And then this then leads to the third I, which is intentionality of investment. So I would say the advisory opinion reinforces that elevated climate and biodiversity loss can be attributed to states and can be seen as a state's internationally wrongful conduct. So it's no longer domestic conduct, but also internationally wrongful conduct, which occurs as a result of such loss. This means that transition risks or physical climate risks or nature-related risks or infrastructure risks are now increasingly being priced in by lenders, by investors, by banks in their investment strategies, as a result of which projects like nature-based solutions, regenerative agriculture, sustainable forestry are gaining appeal, not just as risk mitigation measures, but also as investments that are significantly contributing to the next wave of the revolution, which we like to call the natural capital revolution. So I think the sort of pathway that's being developed from a financial perspective is not only to move away from activities that cause significant harm, but also to start looking at activities that can cause significant contribution towards a climate change mitigation or adaptation objective. Thank you.
Thank you, Varnika. It's so interesting to hear, getting into the specifics from someone who is in the industry and really seeing how this is beginning to impact the industry. Moving to another different perspective, I'd like to invite Leah up to speak a bit about what impact you see the advisory opinion from the ICJ having on the legal landscape after COP30, particularly with regard to emerging accountability mechanisms like, for example, ecocide.
Thank you so much for the question, Kate. Thank you so much for the invitation, Francesco, to be here. Thank you to my fellow panelists for setting the scene. It's a pleasure to be back here in Scotland. And yeah, so as all of you have already highlighted, COP30 didn't really explicitly mention or reference the ICJ advisory opinion in its decision text, but it was raised within negotiations, and it's really beginning to shape the legal landscape in important ways. And I would argue that this influence is likely to deepen moving forward. And even if we say or see that the ICJ advisory opinion will not be taken into these spaces or in future COP processes, which, given their contentious, consensus-based nature, might happen or might be the case, it's a process that's independent from that in the sense that it holds an incredible potential for change across and throughout jurisdictions, perhaps even more so than any of the recent COP decisions. So yeah, I really want to speak a little bit more about how the ICJ advisory opinion helps consolidate a broader ecosystem of accountability, climate accountability, but also environmental accountability. And this ecosystem was very much already emerging prior to the advisory opinions, but all of them, not just the ICJ one, has significantly strengthened the legal foundation that we are now building and seeing and building upon. And that's because the advisory opinions clarify what the law requires, and not only what is politically negotiated under the UNFCCC and under other processes. And that's important. So yeah, the fact that the ICJ also doesn't define a primary forum for addressing these global challenges, and that's in some way also a good mechanism, because it shows how the different landscapes which we have to address these challenges in. And it's one tool in the fight against climate change, but an important one in clarifying the obligations. So turning towards the implications for emerging norms and innovations, the ICJ and also its advisory opinion focus very much on states as key actors, and don't really say anything about individual criminal responsibility, for example. And that's why I want to talk about a little bit about ongoing discussions related to ecocide law at another big international court, which is the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to address individual criminal responsibilities. So just to be clear, the ICJ advisory opinion doesn't say anything about ecocide law. And I want to give a little bit of a context of it, so that for those who don't really know so much about the process, we know what we're talking about. So this is regarding a process of the Rome Statute of the Criminal Court, which criminalizes the most severe and grievous crimes of humanity. And currently, mass environmental destruction, although existential, does not fall into this framework, except environmental crimes falls under the provision of war crimes in Article 8 2b4. But this hasn't proven particularly useful due to its stringent mental elements that requires direct intent of the environmental destruction, which unfortunately, both in times of war and peace, environment is often a silent victim. Of course, the high threshold of the crime having to not be clearly excessive in relation to the overall military advantage gained doesn't help either. So that's why in 2021, the independent expert panel met for the drafting of a workable definition to apply in ecocide in times of peace and suggest possible and necessary amendments to the Rome Statute. And I'll quickly read it out to you for those who don't know it. So here, ecocide is defined as unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. And this proposed definition has contributed significantly to progress in implementing ecocide law within criminal law, domestically, but also regionally and international level. And yeah, it's now under consideration and discussion within ICC working group as of September 2024, brought forward by Vanuatu, Fiji and Samoa. But also we're seeing the inclusion of crimes comparable to ecocide in the new EU Environmental Crimes Directive, and also in the European Council of Europe has adopted a landmark treaty on the Convention on the Protection of Environmental Criminal Law, and that's taking place this year. So we're really seeing this consolidation of rules and laws that's defining a range of environmental offenses and sort of establishing frameworks for prosecuting environmental disasters and destruction. And of course, there's also the recent IUCN motion on ecocide, which was passed at the IUCN Congress a couple of months ago. And it's one of the first times that states voted on ecocide at an international stage. And just this month in December, the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC published its policy on addressing environmental damage through the Rome Statute. And this is separate to ecocide law, but it really shows the intention of these big international courts to address environmental harms. We see that at the ICJ and also at the ICC, really realizing that, environmental harm has to be addressed. And it's setting the stage for sort of creating an operational framework for recognizing, investigating, and prosecuting environmental damage. And to just bring this back to the ICJ advisory opinion, all of these normative developments are gaining credibility from the ICJ affirming gravity of climate harm and the legal obligations to address it. So yes, the ICJ advisory opinion is a very strong legal tool that has been given for us to use within the future, and together with many other legal developments that are sort of happening in parallel that are supported through this, through the highest court sort of giving its opinion on climate change and on environmental destruction. Ecocide, is only one of these legal developments that's kind of happening in parallel, and that's has gained sort of also as further support for this. It informs and supports as us at domestic, at regional, at international levels to address climate and biodiversity crisis that we as humans face. And I think, just if you'll allow me to quickly end on a slightly philosophical note, I think sometimes we forget that we are within the whole known universe. The Earth is the only known planet with the ideal conditions for life. And as humans, we possess the ability to possess consciousness, possess the ability to create meaning, to contemplate meaning. So for all we know, the destruction of our planetary conditions for life is also the destruction of consciousness, of meaning within the known universe. And that's big, and we can't solve it through law alone, but law does play an important role in setting the norms and rules that govern society. So let's use them. And yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you for that thought-provoking perspective. I think it's really important to ask the big questions and think about them. I encourage everyone online also to add your questions to the Q&A online. We will have time for questions from the audience in a moment, but I do want to get back to our panelists. And Anna, I'm going to come back to you first. Again, we've talked a bit about accountability, the potential of change, harm, all these different factors. I'm wondering, I think you probably have responses and commentary on what Varnika and Leah have also said, but I'm curious if you can talk a bit about where do we see, and maybe we don't see, the advisory opinion in COP 30 that has just been, and future COPs. What is the interlinkage there? Where do you see potential for accountability and the interlinkage between the two or not?
Thank you. Jogging a little bit to minimize the lag. I think almost all the panelists have in some way addressed, you know, did the ICJ advisory opinion get pick up at COP, particularly the cover decision? So I don't really have a lot that's new to add to that. I would say, like, no, it wasn't in the cover decision, obviously. But the question I'm holding is that a bad thing? And I think if you had asked me 6 months ago, I might have been of the view that, oh yeah, well, maybe it's a good moment for states to use an international forum and a text to reinforce this really great outcome. I think that would have been my gut response, not terribly thoughtful 6 months ago. I actually feel very differently about it now. I actually don't think that it's a bad thing that there's no mention of the ICJ advisory opinion in a COP cover decision this year. And I almost at this point hope that there's no big fight over its inclusion in a COP cover decision next year. And why? It's because why would you take a unanimous opinion of the world's highest court that is extremely clear and then throw it into a process which is the most contested at the international level that you might find on climate, just to reopen all of those same fault lines? Francesco mentioned, again, in your opening remarks, you know, that there were no red lines in the court. Actually, I would put it slightly differently. I think there absolutely were. States had their opportunity to put their red line or their position to the court. Lots of them did that, more than 100, or almost 100. But the difference is that the ICJ, it's not states that decide. Consensus doesn't hold. It's actually the judges that decide. And I think that's very useful. And that's kind of where we are. And so I would, if I were advising states next year, and I don't think I am, I would say don't open it up in that process. I'm not sure that it's useful. And where I see the potential is, I think, again, colleagues have also touched on this. I think in domestic litigation, I think there will be shared standards and it will filter down in ways that are probably very useful. The potential for international state level, interstate litigation, I think is certainly there. Whether it's constructive and when and what kind of case is a bit of an open question. And I think we'll probably see some time pass before states actually try to pull that lever, because it won't be clear how the outcome will land. And also there's ongoing work at the International Law Commission on 2 topics that are of direct relevance to this. So one is on due diligence and the other is compensation for internationally wrongful acts. And if I were a state, I'd probably want to wait for those processes to conclude before trying my hands litigating. And I will.
Thank you for that, Anna. And I'm wondering, sort of a similar question to the other two, to both Varnika and to Leah. In light of sort of the lack of the ICJ advisory opinion really having a spotlight at COP 30, how do you see the advisory opinion from your individual perspectives still maybe influencing those negotiations, maybe influencing what is coming out of those processes that really does make a connection between the ICJ's advisory opinion and potentially the other advisory opinions and this large multilateral global process. What is the influence from your perspective? I'll start with Varnika again.
Thank you, Ed. I think one of the key aspects, and this actually wasn't discussed in the advisory opinion at all, is around Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which wasn't highlighted in the opinion, but a sort of indirect influence of the opinion's point on providing financial assistance, and the fact that developed countries shall provide financial resources to assist developing countries. They will also engage in technology transfer and capacity building, is something that was then subsequently reflected in the Article 6 negotiations at COP30 most recently, where there's been extensive discussion, especially around Article 6.4, where the supervisory body mechanism sort of agreed to standards last year with respect to bilateral or international trades of mitigation outcomes, which is carbon credits. And so creating a carbon market or bilateral trades under 6.2 between states is essentially a sort of financial assistance or finance flow from developed countries to developing countries, whereby countries, for example, Switzerland and Thailand, did the first ever Article 6.2 transaction, where carbon that was sequestered by a forest development project in Thailand was then sold on to Switzerland to count towards Switzerland's nationally determined contributions. So that's the 6.2 mechanism, where I think the opinion has a direct flow. And then 6.4 focuses on private actors as well that can seek corresponding adjustments on behalf of their countries. So, for example, a corporation participating in a compliance carbon market mechanism where a country has set regulations to limit the emissions within each sector, can participate in terms of purchasing correspondingly adjusted credits from another country, as an example, Kenya or Uganda. And this is actually a discussion that's now ongoing, especially within Europe, which has the EU ETS, so that's the emissions trading scheme, which sets a cap of emissions for each sector participating in the scheme. And the discussion now is whether we can allow those Paris Agreement crediting mechanisms credits from carbon markets into the EU ETS. So I think that's sort of the financial assistance side of the decision that can have a direct impact, but that wasn't necessarily espoused at all by the advisory opinion.
Thank you for that. And we'll just go straight to Leah for your perspective. Thank you. And let me just check, Tanya, do we have questions from the online community already? Perfect. Go ahead, Leah.
Yes, thank you. Just to add to that, I think what will be really interesting to watch beginning of next year will be the UN General Assembly and sort of the process that will, because inevitably, I think the advisory opinions will be brought back to the UNGA, because the UNGA is the one that posed the question to the ICJ. So it will be brought back as a resolution probably to the UNGA. So I think it will be quite interesting sort of to watch that. And luckily for the UNGA, that's a majority vote, not consensus based vote, to have states sort of accept the opinion. So I think that will be quite important in setting also the scene of what or might not happen in terms of references to the ICJ advisory opinion at future COPs. I think probably it will be used within sort of negotiations and by countries that are pushing for strong legal action, a stronger framework for climate. Also realizing that, you know, really pushing for that 1.5 degree temperature goal, but also looking at what are the state obligations, and making sure that we are addressing fossil fuels and we're not reverting back to never mentioning fossil fuels in COP processes, which I feel like is a bit of a back and forth between it took forever for it first to be mentioned in a cover decision. And then finally, when it was at COP28 in Dubai, then now it's not really being mentioned again. And I think this very much depends, of course, also on the political landscape that we find ourselves in. But I think certainly really great that the advisory opinion has such a strong reference to this. And I think states will use this in negotiations, whether or not that's to be included in any cover decision. I mean, I think maybe I agree with what Anna said. It might be, yeah, maybe we should be careful not to reopen some of those discussions and those rifts, because the first and foremost, we have to accept that the ICJ is the highest court. It's the UN court. It answered the question that was said by the UNGA. So yeah, really looking forward and hoping to see the resolution of the UNGA on this in the new year. But yeah, looking forward to the questions from online and from the audience.
Thank you so much, Leah. We do have time for some questions. Are there any in the room before we go to the online questions? Any questions in the room for our panelists or for Francesco? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. Super interesting. I'm going to ask a question from a position of ignorance. So I come from engineering science background, so the legal process, super interesting, but quite new for me. My question is that the advisory opinion applies to states, is that right? And so is it the states who have an obligation to transfer that down to, for example, multinational? And then my question is, if you have, let's say, oil and gas company, if you have the transferable obligation down to a transnational oil and gas company, they're going to grant or look at oil extraction in, let's say, Nigeria. British companies operating in Nigeria, just to use which states is ultimately bearing responsibility for that? Is it a British-owned company operating internationally, or is it Nigeria allowing that to take place? And is that justice allocated there, or the UK has done its oil and gas extraction also Nigeria?
So for the benefit of the online community, I will repeat the question as much as I can. And I think Francesco is perfectly situated to answer this question. The question comes from an engineering and science perspective, and in your words, from a place of ignorance. So the question really is, how does the advisory opinion, since it really only does apply to states, how do those obligations and the accountability mechanisms trickle down to private actors? And your example of a UK company going to extract oil in, for example, Nigeria, which country's laws govern the process? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Perfect. And Francesco, I think, is perfectly situated to answer.
Thank you very much, Donald. I think you're underestimating yourself. You're actually a very good lawyer. So trying to be very brief. Private sector doesn't operate in a void. It operates within a territorial jurisdiction. So as strong as Chevron may be, or whoever may be, they do need some sort of authorization from a public authority. So that's where the link comes in. So a state, whatever state, the UK or Nigeria, has a due diligence obligation, stringent, less stringent, that's another issue. So it's on the state to have that obligation that filters down to authorize or not a company to do X, Y, Z. Now, the question, if there's a Dutch company, a British company operating in a different territory, that brings all sorts of extraterritoriality kind of aspects. The interesting thing is that we thought we were finished with advisory opinions, but actually this year and next year, we'll have a further advisory opinion before the African Court of Human Rights and People's Rights. And that specific question has been asked to the court. What are the obligations of African states vis-a-vis multinationals and non-African countries operating in the territory? And behind that question, you can see two things. You can see the justice element that you mentioned. You know, these are big companies from wherever in the world, be it China, be it the UK, operating in Africa. But it also, if you read that question, it also implies, well, Nigeria or whoever it is cannot just say, well, it's not me. They also have obligations. So it's upon the state because a company operates within the state. It's the same thing here in Scotland. I'll stop with that.
So let's get a question from online. Tanya, do you have? Oh, wait, while we get that ready, we have another question in the room. Yes. Of course.
To things like carbon markets,
Mhm.
Article 6,
Mhm.
where the what's put up its jurisdiction would then be able to set the necessary regulatory framework for a voluntary carbon market and sale of carbon credits to the private sector. Next to amendments to international investment treaty obligations and such like, so that in the future there are no or perhaps limited grounds for companies to challenge ongoing development of the frameworks in countries to comply with the advisory opinion guidance and to ensure that they are able to develop their own rights-based frameworks, energy frameworks, investment frameworks, without threats to multilateral companies who are buying or trying to buy carbon credits, say in the forest sector, which may forestall changes in their own domestic legislation. And how will the advisory enable changes to investment treaties, including things like the Istanbul Free Trade Agreement? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I will try and summarize. Varnika did hear the question, and I'm going to ask Varnika to answer the question. The question really is how will the advisory opinion, or will it impact investment treaties and their impacts, particularly in global South countries? Varnika, did you want to take that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that's an excellent question. And so as of now, countries, especially in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, are, as you rightly said, developing their internal domestic frameworks for the carbon market, which looks at three aspects of the carbon market. So they're creating an internal compliance market. They're then creating an international carbon market, which will be guided by the Article 6 principles of the Paris Agreement. And they're creating a voluntary carbon market, which is outside of the Article 6 framework. Whether the investments towards a carbon market, for example, in an agricultural project or a forestry project in Kenya, count as or are treated as an investment under bilateral investment treaties depends on the treaty aspects between two host countries. So, for example, between Luxembourg and Kenya, the definition of investment is broad enough, as an example, to account for forestry-related investments. But in certain BITs, that would not fall within the scope of bilateral investment treaty definitions. And so you look at other forms of private litigation. For now, we have already seen a lot of public participation globally, as well as interest for bilateral and multilateral dialogue in influencing a country's domestic legislation with respect to carbon markets. So just as an example, Kenya came up with their climate change and carbon market regulations in 2024, which invited dialogue from different countries, from private actors, from NGOs and think tanks as well. So that the creation of these domestic legislations is now increasingly a multilateral process. And part of the advisory opinion that bleeds directly into this creation is the aspect that talks about countries' nationally determined contributions and the fact that countries need to reflect the highest levels of ambition in setting up their frameworks for those NDCs and their targets, as well as creating carbon market mechanisms. So I think it doesn't explicitly call out a carbon market mechanism or Article 6, but the NDC obligation flows directly into the Paris process, which then flows into a country's domestic frameworks for carbon markets.
Thank you, Varnika. Did that answered your question? I think at least in part, I would imagine. Well, we can have more discussion. We can definitely have more discussion during the coffee break as well. All right, let's get to some of the online questions. And I'm just seeing these now. Do we know if the advisory opinion supported negotiators in the room, despite not finding its way into the final outcome document? And I think we'll group a couple of questions together. So that's the first question to the panelists. And then also connected to that, I think, what does the ICJ advisory opinion mean for climate justice? So let's start with those two questions. Anna is furiously taking notes. Does that mean you want to answer this question? We'll start with you on this sort of broad question.
I was starting to take notes and I don't have time to take notes. So you're just going to have to go with me on the fly as thoughts come to me. So do I know, okay, was it used in the room? I know anecdotally from colleagues that it was brought up in corridors and informally, yes. Do I think that there was enough probably depth or granular understanding of some of the implications in order to then really build the coalitions of countries and negotiating blocks that you might need to actually do something very useful under time pressure? Probably not. But maybe, you know, next year, the year after, we can start to see some of that. What was the what does it mean for climate justice? That's a very big question. I think I would pick up two examples. I think it's significant, the finding that if states breach the obligations set out in the opinion, that will give rise to state responsibility and therefore legal consequences follow. I think for most people's conception of what climate justice implies, that's really important. Legal consequences follow if you breach these obligations that you hold. And then one more area is maybe with respect to the Paris Agreement. A concrete example is this underlining that developed states have a legal obligation to provide finance to developing countries for their mitigation and adaptation at levels that are capable of delivering on that 1.5 degree target. I think that's also quite consequential for most people's understanding of climate justice. I don't know if there are any more questions that I have not answered, but I'll leave.
Do either of the other panelists have a viewpoint on how the advisory opinion, what it means for climate justice? I have some thoughts myself. While we think about this, Leah, you look like you want to say something. So I think that what's interesting to me about the advisory opinion is if you look really carefully, not just at the advisory opinion itself, the separate opinions of the various judges on the ICJ, and crucially also the submissions by the various states and organizations to the process, you can really get a sense of how different perspectives frame climate justice, or in the case of a lot of, I would say, small island developing states, climate injustice that exists in our current system. And I think that there was some progress made in the advisory opinion toward climate justice, but I think there's quite a distance to go. Is there something that you wanted to add to that, Leah? If not, we can move on to the next question. Look, you do wonderful.
I'll say something quickly because I know this is like a very big question, and it really goes into the deeper questions of what do we understand also as climate justice, which I think overall our whole discussion has been trying to kind of center around that question. What did the ICJ advisory opinion mean, and how does it relate to different aspects in society? But I think maybe perhaps also what you mentioned, Kate, to highlight that this process has been started by sort of small island developing states, and I think it's really quite consequential to see sort of these small states that, I mean, maybe in other areas or previously weren't thought to have a lot of diplomatic power or weight in them, have really kind of shifted this conversation to the legal sphere. And of course, this sets sort of the framework and the baseline for what we can use within climate justice. But then again, also climate justice is so much more, right? It's also looking at different areas of social justice as different sectors of society that extend beyond the legal, where we have to question what does that mean. And I really hope that maybe also through this discussion today, but also through wherever you as the audience are going within your workplaces, within your environments, you can bring knowledge of the ICJ advisory opinion to that discussion on climate justice to really have a think about what does that mean for us and what can we take from that going forward. And I think maybe that's something for all of us here today online or in person to kind of take forward as like an action point of like, what does it mean for climate justice? What does it mean for us as individuals living on Earth, kind of acting forward? So there's so much more to say, but let's move on to the next question.
All right, I think we might have time for one more question before we wrap up. Thank you for your report. I have a question regarding the impact on companies. Is the discussion on corporate behavior change centered around nature-based solutions related to COP30? Does this mean there was discussion among non-state actors at COP? Are you aware of any sort of external to the negotiations, discussions around nature-based solutions and corporate behavior change that happened, Varnika?
Thank you. And this is secondhand knowledge, as I wasn't present at COP30. But there were a lot of non-state discussions around not only investing in nature-based solutions, but also the relevance of nature-based solutions and the use case of the outputs that come out of nature-based solutions, such as carbon credits. So there's an international sustainable forestry coalition, which is essentially a global north coalition of forestry asset managers that invest into forestry assets or creating forests. And one of the big discussions there was, are nature-based solutions being scoped out of Article 6.4 because of the levels of additionality and permanence that are being required under the principles and standards adopted under 6.4. So I would say that was a big question of concern. Is the discussion on corporate behavior change centered around nature-based solutions? No, I would say nature-based solutions still remain a small aspect of corporate discussions. The corporate discussions right now are largely led by regulatory requirements of disclosure under European regulations on sustainable finance, like the EU taxonomy, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, the incoming Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and in the US, what they've now scrapped, the SEC Climate Rule, which essentially talks about private actors' impact on the environment and assessing using a double materiality lens. So you look, as a company, you look at the impact of nature and the environment on your financial statements and your balance sheet, and your impact on the environment from a non-financial perspective. So I would say corporate discussions are largely based around disclosure, and then voluntary frameworks like the TNFD or previously the TCFD, which is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures or Climate Disclosures, are sort of the guiding beacons that are moving discussions towards nature-based solutions, but they wouldn't be taking center stage as of today.
Thank you for that, Varnika. I want to thank, there are lots and lots of questions that we do not have time to get to. I want to thank the panelists for your thoughtful contributions and hand over to Francesco for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Kate. First of all, some word of thanks. Huge thanks to IUCN, to the World Commission on Environmental Law, in particular to Roberto and obviously Christina for opening this webinar. Roberto is our colleague who supports the wide WCEL. Obviously also huge thanks to Tanya Agarwal, our PhD researcher at the law school, who also supported the organization of this webinar, and the wider Strathclyde team. Thanks for the panelists for coming to Glasgow, to joining us today, and to those who came on a early Monday morning. It's a Monday, no? On a Monday morning, close to the festive season. So thank you so much for coming. Since you're here, why not stay a wee bit more? So we're going to have a half-hour break. There's coffee outside, virtual coffee for those online. And then from 11 to 12, this is an IUCN World Commission on Environmental Climate Change Law Specialist Group event. So why not stay and learn more about this very long name? So in the next hour from 11 to 12, we're going to say a little bit more and introduce you to IUCN, WCEL, Climate Change Specialist Group, and hopefully you can stay. Also, those of you online, if you have registered, there's a different Zoom link to click, and thank you, Roberto, for putting it in the chat. Feel free to register if you haven't done so. We open registrations until the last minute. We have no problems with it. So in terms of content, to wrap up considerations. The first one is that I used the image of leaving the door ajar. I never use the word ajar. I don't even know what it means, to be honest, in English, but it seems to work. So the door is just a wee bit open, just a little bit. And the more I read the ICJ advisory opinion, I feel it's like that. There are a lot of things that until the 23rd of July were completely shut. Compensation, all sort of things, some ambiguity on the legally bindingness or not, and so forth. And now the door is definitely, in some cases it's way, way open, but in some cases it's just a little bit open. So when it comes to operationalizing the advisory opinion, I think there's a question on strategy. Do we want to open the door? When do we want to open the door? Do we have any clue what we're doing when we're opening the door? How strong do we have to push the door open? And all those kind of things. So I think whether it's a IUCN, whether it's a state, whether it's an individual academic, whether it's a student, those strategical questions, which have legal but also non-legal implications, are really interesting, but also important. The second point is about this relationship between the door halfway open and the political process of COPs. So the answer for COP30 is some people tried, they were disappointed, it's not there. I, to be honest, agree with Anna and others. I wasn't that bothered even before COP30, whether it would have been included or not. I actually completely agree with the points both you, Anna, and others are made. You know, why put something that was nicely framed on the 23rd of July and put it in a cauldron and then come out in a completely different way? So probably it's almost clever not to actually put it in that cauldron. However, think of the questions we had: nature-based solutions, investment. The beauty and the challenge of COP processes is that they're talking about society. They're talking about everything from the moment you wake up in the morning to the moment you go up at night in a super skyscraper rich country like Singapore or a least developed country of your choice. It's all there. So this really has complicated implications when it comes to COP process. Next year is another one of those super COP years. So we're going to have climate COP, biodiversity COP, desertification COP. And if I think of nature-based solutions, I actually wonder, what about CBD COP? A lot of it is there, actually. So I'll finish with actually wondering whether this discussion about the relationship between judicial process at the ICJ and the COP process is actually not much a bigger question about the COP process itself. A, we need to understand it. Two, we need to understand its limits as well. But that doesn't mean we have to ditch it. We just have to rethink it, make it more efficient in a world which is ever more complex. So I'll stop there, but I hope you can join me for coffee, and I'll hope to see all of you in the coffee and at 11 o'clock. Thank you very much.